Welcome back to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're here today because we're diving into one of the absolute most fascinating topics in human biology. Every single biological system inside you is constantly using chemicals to send instructions. But to really wrap our heads around psychopharmacology, I want you to think about how information gets shared in a school system. Right? It happens at totally different scales of teaching. Sometimes you need a one-on-one tutor. Other times, you need a classroom teacher broadcasting to a whole group. And sometimes, you need the superintendent to send a massive mandate out to the entire district. Well, in our bodies, our chemical messengers follow this exact same logic.
And so that brings us to the fundamental question we're tackling today. How does your brain literally teach your body to act, feel, and ultimately survive, moment to moment? To figure that out, we're going to start by zooming way in on the microscopic spaces between your brain cells, the synapses, and then we'll scale all the way out to the rushing rivers of your entire bloodstream.
Here's the syllabus for today's explainer. We'll start with the body's chemical messengers, move on to neurotransmitters, then neuromodulators, neurohormones, and finally, we'll pull back to look at the big picture. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. The body's chemical messengers.
Moving to Section 2. Neurotransmitters. One-on-one signals.
So chemical communication in the nervous system basically boils down to two things: distance and duration. On one far end of that spectrum, you've got highly localized, lightning-fast signals. Going back to our analogy, neurotransmitters are the strict one-on-one tutors of the nervous system. They're the primary chemical messengers responsible for localized, rapid, point-to-point communication between neurons at specialized sites called synapses. Now, the absolute key words here are localized and rapid. We're talking about signals firing in mere milliseconds, teaching a single neighboring cell exactly what to do in a highly precise, highly isolated environment.
But here's the thing, not just any chemical gets to call itself a neurotransmitter. It's actually a really elite club with super strict entry rules. To be a classic neurotransmitter, a chemical has to pass this entire checklist. It must be present in the presynaptic terminal. It has to be synthesized by specific enzymes right there inside the cell. It's got to be released in significant quantities the moment an electrical signal, an action potential, arrives. Plus, there have to be very specific receptors waiting for it on the receiving cell. And finally, its arrival actually has to produce a measurable change in that receiving cell. If a chemical fails even one of these tests, no badge. It is not a classic neurotransmitter.
Now, looking at the sheer variety of these messengers, we can casually group them into three main families. First up, the amino acids. These are the most abundant in the brain. Glutamate is your brain's main excitatory transmitter. It basically stomps on the gas pedal. GABA and glycine, they are your primary inhibitory transmitters, so they hit the brakes. Next, we have the amines. These are the heavy hitters you've probably heard of, like acetylcholine for muscle contraction and learning, plus monoamines like dopamine and serotonin that regulate your mood. And finally, lipids and gases, like nitric oxide. Honestly, these are wild. They act as retrograde messengers, meaning they actually diffuse backwards to teach the sending neuron how to adjust its future signals.
And regardless of which family they belong to, all these neurotransmitters follow a very rigid life cycle. Step 1 is synthesis. They're created either in the nerve terminals or the cell body. Step 2 is storage, where they get neatly packed away into these little biological bubbles called synaptic vesicles. Step 3 is release, expelled straight into the synaptic cleft. And step 4, which is absolutely crucial, is clearance. The signal has to stop. The lesson is over, class dismissed. So the chemical is either sucked back up by reuptake transporters or it's completely destroyed by enzymes like acetylcholinesterase. It's this incredibly dynamic, continuous loop happening billions of times a second in your head right now.
Section 3. Neuromodulators, volume transmission.
Okay, let's slow our pacing down just a bit and scale things up. If neurotransmitters are the one-on-one tutors, neuromodulators are the classroom teachers. They aren't just whispering to one specific student, they're broadcasting a message to the entire room. By definition, they are naturally secreted substances, mostly peptides, operating in expanded space and time to regulate our general behavioral states. They play this amazing intermediate regulatory role. Basically, they manage the overall mood or the environment of the brain, teaching large groups of neurons just how sensitive or reactive they should be to other incoming information.
You can really see the distinct difference in how they deliver their lessons. Neurotransmitters rely on point-to-point communication. It's direct, crossing a tiny microscopic gap like passing a note directly to the person next to you. Neuromodulators, on the other hand, use what's called volume transmission. They get released into the extracellular fluid and literally diffuse over much longer distances to affect a whole bunch of neurons at once. So the really cool takeaway here is how these diffuse modulatory systems dictate our overall behavioral states. They often start in these tiny little clusters deep down in the brainstem, places like the locus coeruleus for norepinephrine or the Raphi nuclei for serotonin. And from there, they project widely outward. They are in charge of the big picture stuff, your arousal, your mood, vigilance, even pain sensitivity. And they do this by primarily binding to metabotropic or G-protein coupled receptors. Now, unlike the lightning-fast ionotropic receptors used in basic neurotransmission, metabotropic receptors are playing the long game. They act much slower, producing deep, long-lasting changes in the brain's circuitry.
Section 4. Neurohormones, systemic communication. All right, now we are zooming way out to the district-wide superintendent broadcast. This is a massive shift in how the body communicates. Neurohormones are chemicals produced by specialized neurosecretory cells, mostly hanging out in the hypothalamus. But here's the magic trick. Instead of releasing their chemical instructions into a synaptic cleft, these cells release hormones directly into your bloodstream. We are literally taking electrical nervous system signals and converting them into systemic endocrine signals. And this is a brilliant little system that perfectly illustrates the two totally distinct methods the hypothalamus uses to control the pituitary gland and dump these instructions into our bodies. On one side, we have the posterior pituitary. Here, magnocellular cells release neurohormones like oxytocin, which is huge for social bonding, and vasopressin, which regulates your blood pressure, directly into the capillaries. But on the other side, the anterior pituitary acts a bit differently. Parvocellular cells secrete releasing hormones, like CRH, which just travel a very short distance to trigger the anterior pituitary to release its own tropic hormones into the general circulation.
Once they hit that general circulation, it is a completely different ballgame. Neurohormones travel throughout the entire body. They hunt for distant target cells that have the exact right receptors. And this is exactly how your brain manages to coordinate massive, slow, and deeply entrenched biological responses for things like stress, metabolism, and reproduction. The sheer scale and duration of these systemic effects completely dwarfs those microscopic, rapid-fire one-on-one tutors we started our journey with.
Finally, Section 5, the big picture. Bringing it all together, we can really appreciate the absolute brilliance of this multi-tiered curriculum. The nervous system doesn't just rely on one single way to teach the body how to react. It uses the highly specific, rapid one-on-one tutors, the neurotransmitters, to handle immediate actions and sensory input. It uses the classroom teachers, the neuromodulators, to set the overarching tone, shifting our mood and our arousal. And it uses the district superintendents, the neurohormones, to enforce long-term systemic adaptations for survival and growth. Which brings us to a final thought for you to ponder today. We've traced how these chemicals dictate literally everything we do. But if every single thought, feeling, and action is ultimately just a delicate balance of these chemical instructions, constantly teaching yourselves what to do, who is really writing the lesson plan? Are we the masters of our biology, or is our biology mastering us? Take a moment to really think about that one. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you in the next one.